Hi, I'm Alicia, and this is Unencumbered. Today we'll be talking about how I became an affirming Christian. I decided to do this video during the month of Pride because I think this is the time where we celebrate same-sex relationships, people who are in the LGBT community. This is the month to do that. But I also wanted to not center myself. So this video isn't me centering my journey as like this important journey that, you know, everyone needs to know about. But really just what I was thinking is that I know how difficult it can be for people to change perspective, especially when you grow up a certain way, you grow up hearing something, you grow up being told one way is right and one way is wrong. And so it's really hard to like really chip at what that means. And so as someone who grew up hearing that same-sex relationships or anyone in the LGBT plus community was wrong, and getting to a point where I'm like, that's what's wrong. Like that perspective is what's wrong. This is what's right. Loving people well and making them feel affirmed in their identity. So I wanted to kind of create a video that just explains what that journey was like for me. Basically to encourage other Christians who are like, I don't really know what I believe about this, or I feel uncomfortable, I don't know what the resources are. I'm hoping that this video can be a starting point for people and that we can continue to do the work of trying to really understand what it means to be Christian and a part of the LGBT plus community, or what it means to be Christian and to be affirming. And another thing with that is that I really wanted to, in the beginning of my journey with these videos, is that I wanted to make it very clear as to where I stand. I don't know what it's like to be an individual, a part of the LGBT plus community, going into a church and you're sitting there and the pastor, and you're just waiting and hoping that the pastor doesn't say anything against your community, against you, against your partner, etc. But I do know what it's like to be a Black woman in a white church and waiting to like, okay, what are they gonna say? Or like, how could I twist what they said to kind of make it sound okay, even though it didn't sound okay? So I kind of relate in that way, even though it's not the same thing. And so I just wanted, as someone who is starting a faith channel, who has a faith channel, a Christian channel, I just wanted to be very clear as to where I stand. So anyone that watches these videos knows that that is my stance, and that's an unwavering stance. To get to that point was a journey. Like, it wasn't something that happened automatically. It was something that took me a while to like really get comfortable, and to really not only get comfortable with the idea, but just getting comfortable saying it and declaring it, really. So I just want to walk through that journey a little bit. So I kind of think of it in different stages. The first stage is really just who I am as a person. So I just kind of grew up with this idea that everyone should be treated fairly. You should love people. No one should feel like the underdog. No one should be bullied and like that kind of thing. So I would say that stage, I didn't really know too many people who were gay, or like I didn't really know anyone who was trans at that point when I was younger. I don't even remember, honestly, I don't remember. The only thing I can remember is like that SpongeBob episode where SpongeBob and Patrick are pretending to be parents to the little clam. And I remember hearing on the radio, people were like, oh, this is just horrible that they have this, you know, SpongeBob and Patrick being a couple when they're both men, and like that's bad. And so I do remember that as a kid, but that's the one thing that stands out. But I just didn't remember hearing a lot about it. And like SpongeBob, I was like, well, that's not even what's happening. Like, they're just pretending to be mom and dad. Like, it's not even a big deal, you know. Anyway, so I think at that beginning stage, it really was just about like everyone should be treated fairly. It's not really an issue because I didn't have people that I knew that were gay. And then I got into middle school, and I remember it just seemed like a flood of things were happening. And I remember very specifically American Idol with Adam Lambert. And I loved him from like the first episode. I was like, I don't remember what season that is, but I remember he was so great. And this is when like American Idol was like everyone's favorite show. So he was just a phenomenal singer, very theatrical, so talented. And I remember we got up to like the finale show, and this picture came out of him kissing a man. And it was like this huge thing where it's like, oh, can we have a gay American Idol? It's American Idol. What does idol mean, you know? And all that stuff. And so he didn't win. And I remember thinking, I'm like, the person he lost to was nowhere in the same caliber of talent as Adam Lambert. Not that he wasn't talented, but when you compare the two, there was no way that he should have won over Adam Lambert. And I remember feeling angry about that and thinking, I'm like, did he really not win because he was gay? Like, that's not okay. And so at that point, like, my frustration wasn't even connected to me trying to think like, oh, what does faith mean in this situation? But just like, this is an injustice. I mean, that sounds a little strong. This is an injustice that was the reason why he lost. Like, I don't, if that played a factor into it. I believe that it did, but maybe it didn't. And then also in middle school, I actually created a tolerance club with my friends, and it was really just like a catch-all of anyone who felt like they were being discriminated against. I went to a very white elementary and middle school, and so anyone, if you were any other color than white, like you were in this club, because there was only a few of us, and it was a club where we all felt comfortable. If you were gay, you were in this club. It was run by the art teacher, because the art teacher always runs that kind of stuff, and it was just, we just hung out. We didn't even have like a mission. We just need a space where people of color and people in the LGBT plus community could just be. We weren't even trying to like change anything necessarily. We were just like, we just need a place to be and feel comfortable. And so that's what that club was for us. Also around that time is when Lady Gaga's Born This Way came out, and I remember just listening to those lyrics, and it just felt so good and it felt so right what she was saying. Hearing a little bit of the backstory of like why she wrote the song and why she thought the song was essential and important for when she wrote it, that really stuck with me. And I remember specifically hearing stories about, and this was like, middle school, I was starting to hear stories about like teenagers and preteens taking their lives because of being gay or being trans and like not knowing how to tell their families, or being made fun of in school and bullied. And so that's really when my heart began to say like, wow, like this is seriously heartbreaking that people, because they're just feeling so isolated and because they feel so alienated because of their sexuality, they're taking their lives, and that's not okay. And for me, I was like, I feel like at this point I wasn't really thinking about like, how does my faith fit into this? Because I went to a church that was kind of like had the, I very much dislike this theology, but had the theology of hate the sin, love the sinner, right? So that was like their theology. But then they also never talked about it. So it was like, this is just, so you know how churches will sometimes say things like, everyone is welcome here, or we accept you no matter what, but then they have like this whole list of conditions. That's kind of what the church was. But the conditions, it was something that you had to like slowly discover. Like, okay, you're welcome here as long as your political beliefs are like this. You're welcome here as long as you don't challenge us too much on these things that we accept as true. You're welcome here as long as you're not a member of the LGBT plus community or an active member. It was never talked about, so I really had no idea that it was necessarily wrong according to that, that theology. I didn't really know. Especially because for me, I'm like, oh, I go to church and I love it. Like, they're telling me stories. Everyone's so sweet to me. Everyone cares about me. Like when I go home, or like when I'm at school and I feel like people are mean, I go to church and everyone's like nice, and all my church friends would like play with me, and it was like wonderful, So I had that very positive perspective on the church. So I wasn't even thinking like, oh, what does the church think about this? It was just like, oh, well, obviously if we tell people that we love God and we love others, if that's who we are, then of course we're going to be on the side of the people who are struggling and the people who are feeling alienated and really just pushed out of their homes and things like that. And so I was like, oh, of course the Christians are going to be on that side. And it wasn't until this was like late middle school. I remember I went into church, and this was around the time when the decisions were being made about same-sex marriage, like very early on conversations. I think same-sex marriage wasn't legalized until 2016. This was early on when conversations were happening kind of like at the state level. So there was a petition going around. It was like, if you are a Maryland resident and you don't believe same-sex marriage should be legal in Maryland, just sign this petition. So I remember I was sitting in church, and the sermon, the pastor just like ends the sermon. He's just kind of like, oh, and if you want to sign this petition, it's in the lobby. So on your way out, sign it because we know what true marriage is, you know, et cetera, et cetera. Went on his whole little spiel. And I remember being like, no, like that feels wrong. That feels not right in my spirit. And I'm very much like a person that tries to listen to what's happening internally in addition to, you know, what's happening on the outside. But I'm like, if something doesn't feel right in my spirit, and I don't take that as just like an emotional thing, like I do think that was a spiritual thing. I'm like, this doesn't feel good. This doesn't feel right. This doesn't feel Christian to me. So I ended up leaving that church for a while, and I eventually do come back. But I leave it for a while. I just go to another church. And at the other church, it was one of those things back to like the whole, we don't say it out loud, but we probably believe this thing. So like there weren't sermons about it. It was just something that everyone kind of knew. You know, no one's going to talk about it, but we all know like what the theology is. I was going to that church for a while, and then I go back to the other church, and then I start high school. So in high school, I also joined the Tolerance Club, and their Tolerance Club was completely different. So my high school, very diverse, very welcoming, very accepting. Like you come in dressed as Batman every day, and no one's gonna blink an eye. We're just gonna be like, okay, cool, you're Batman. That's what you want to do. Great. Like it was very, very accepting, which is wonderful because you felt like no matter who you are or where you came from, like you would always be able to find a group. Like there's going to be a group of people here, group there, and there's also like like interplay between groups. Like it wasn't like cliquish. It was like, okay, we can kind of hang with these people, but then we can go and hang with these people. So this Tolerance Club was different from the one in middle school. It was more action based. I remember having discussions about like laws and things like, okay, this is happening. What do we think about this? How is this going to affect this community? We were really talking about issues and like what we can do as students and what we can do in our schools to like change perspectives and things like that. So I was in that club, and we even had a conversations about like, is tolerance like a good word for the club? Because tolerance suggests that you're just tolerating, you know, I'm just gonna, as much as I can stay away from you without it being too annoying. So it's like, do you really want that to be the name of the club? So we had a lot of different conversations in that club. And that was really when I started to think like politically about the issue. So at first I would say my first stage, it was more of like I don't like people to feel like outsider. I don't like people to feel alienated. So that is why I'm interested in this issue. And then it became like political. Like, does the church have the right to say what the state can do? And so that's kind of what it was for a while. And I, at that point, was not thinking about like what the church thinks, didn't really have, and I honestly was like not even trying to do the work, if that makes sense, the work of trying to understand like how my faith and these issues combine. Like I wasn't even doing that work. I would say I was very much like two people. You know, I was kind of like, okay, I go to church, but I'm not thinking about these issues. I knew at some point I was going to have a conversation between the two and try to understand what I believe. And so that came when I began a leadership program. So this is at the first church. So I went back to that church, and I was a part of the leadership program there, where we were encouraged to read the Bible every day and journal about our thoughts. And so I really got into it, partly because I really wanted to know what I believed. And I remember being in high school, and I just hated that I didn't know what was in the text that I read. So like people who like atheists, or not, you know, to say anything bad about atheists, but you know, you do have the ones that are like constantly berating you, and it's like, okay, relax, you believe what you believe, I believe what I believe, chill. As long, like, of course you can critique me on things that are, you know, actively hurting people, but when I'm just chilling, like, why are you coming at me? Like, we could believe different things. Anyway, so they would come up to me and say things like, well, the Bible says this, and what do you think about that? And I would be like, does it? Good to know. Let me like look at that, and I'll get back to you. Because, you know, at that point I was like, yeah, I had my little children's Bible. I had a regular Bible too, but like I didn't really read it. So when I got to that leadership program, I was like, okay, this is my chance, like really read and see what it says. And I don't even honestly remember. I feel like I read past the sections, you know, in Leviticus. I was like, okay, that's what used to be, or like that's cultural, the same way that I would read and Ephesians and other New Testament texts with the household codes about women submitting to their husbands. I was like, okay, that's all cultural. That's what I was kind of saying in my head. So it wasn't really an issue. It was just kind of like, this is cultural. Like, I know what my heart says. I know what the Spirit says that's within me. And I don't think that needs to have like a whole explanation, right? I'm okay with being like, I don't know. I just know it's right. I wasn't trying to figure out like, how do I arrange these verses so it makes sense? Like, wasn't what I was doing at that point. I was just like, okay, it's cultural. I don't know. I just know that it doesn't feel right if we're saying that Jesus is, the giver of life, and life, like faith is life-giving, and then you see that actively discriminating against the LGBT plus community leads to suicide. So it's like, how is that life-giving? And so that was, for me, it was more about loving people than trying to figure out how to put verses together or arrange text together to make it seem like the Bible is affirming. And this is when I got to college, and I was like, I've just never been comfortable with love the sinner, hate the sin. Like, I've never liked that, because it doesn't feel like true love. Like, you're gonna say you love someone, but then have these conditions, right, of how they have to act and what they have to do to be loved by you. And then when you think about the cause of not loving that person fully and their identity leads to all this negative stuff, and you think, wow, what is it like when you love someone in their identity and treat them well and affirm who they are? Beautiful, life-giving things, and they feel lovely about themselves, and they are more active in their faith because they can see that their faith and their identity are connected. So also, while I was in high school, I remember watching this documentary, and I think it was called Pray the Gay Away, but she talks to different church members and church leaders, and she says, like, what do you believe about this? What do you believe about, like, what does your text say about this? What is your relation? So she goes like both sides of the spectrum. So she has people who are affirming and Christians who are not affirming. And I remember for the not affirming ones, from what I remember, it's been a really long time since, it was just kind of like, oh, well, that's what I've read. That's what my tradition has taught me. This is what I believe to be true. And so this is why. And I think and it was a lot of like love the sinner, hate the sin language. And then on the other side, the affirming side, it was like, there are only a few texts in the Bible that say anything against same-sex relationships. So we are going to love and I remember especially there was a scene where it was like these kids, these boys, and they were like free to dress how they wanted, and they did like a fashion show for them so they could wear dresses and they could celebrate who they were, and like there was no stigma to it. And that church was saying like, well, this is what we believe, like this is how we believe we share the love of Christ with people, is allowing them to freely express themselves in their identities. And so I remember watching that documentary, and it was a time when I was like beginning to try to push those ideas together. And so seeing that, I was like, oh wow, there are churches that actually believe that. But then when he was like, oh, they're just a couple of verses, I was just kind of, something about me was like, I feel like we need to do more. I wanted there to be more like, okay, we found this text and realized that it was wrong, So that's when I was at that point, I was like, I wanted more. And so fast forward a little bit, then I get to college, I'm taking this class called Sex and Violence in the Bible. And the purpose of the class was to show how the Bible can be used, has been used, continues to be used to perpetuate violence. And so we talked about texts that were used for racial violence. Of course, we talked about slavery. We talked about domestic violence. And so then we get to the text about same-sex relationships, and texts in Leviticus and Deuteronomy, not wearing women's clothes or not wearing the opposite sex clothes and things like that. And so we talked about, and I think we watched a documentary about like how damaging that is for people who are a part of the LGBT plus community when they hear their faith group saying these things. We talked very, very openly about like how these texts perpetuate that. And we also had various opinions in that class. So a lot of like people had the love the sinner, hate the sin language, and like we're using that like, oh, I can do that. And then people who are part of the LGBT plus community saying like, no, that hasn't worked. We just watched a documentary about how people are dying from that theology. And so it was a very difficult, but I think important step for me in understanding how important it is to not only do the work of trying to understand like what certain verses mean, and do the work of trying to hear different people's stories and trying to understand their perspectives and like how they're living, like what do they say about themselves as an LGBT plus Christian. It was really helpful for me to say like, okay, like I need to do that work. I need to start studying what's called queer theology, and like I need to see like what do we believe, like how are we supporting our beliefs. I would say I'm a student now of like trying to really understand what the text means and what the text has said, and like how do we deal with the complexity of it all. And I've been learning some really awesome things. And so doing the work of like reading queer theology and trying to understand like not only the part of just like, oh, how do you exist, you know, because there's obviously theology that does that, where it's like trying to understand like what do these verses mean in context. Is Paul actually saying things about same-sex marriage, or is he saying things about pedophilia? Like how do we understand these texts? So like there's that section of queer theology, and the other part of the theology is just saying like, who are the queer people in the Bible? How is my identity celebrated in this? And so I've been learning a lot in that direction as well. I'm thinking specifically of something that I learned about the Hebrew word that describes Joseph's coat and his like coat of many colors that his father gives him, is that it's the same word that describes like, I think, what princesses wear, something like that. And I was like, wow, like that's such an interesting fact. In this text we have Joseph, who's like this wonderful character in the Bible, and he's wearing this very flamboyant coat, and that's beautiful that that's being celebrated. And it's like, oh, this is something that the princesses will wear, and you're wearing it. Like that's, I think, a cool detail. And I think the more that I learn things like that, is the more that I become even more affirming. And I think always for me, it's always going to come down to people and stories. I recently read this book that's also a movie, and it's called Prayers for Bobby, and it talks about this teenager who, his family was very religious, and he very early on was like, knew he was gay, and they kind of, you know, figured it out. And he just felt like when they would say things, they would, you know, post Bible verses for him, and you just read. So the book is basically his diary entries, and you just hear his struggle. And so anyone who is like really trying to understand like how Christians can be affirming, I think you have to look at the effect of not being affirming. And his story is one of the ones where you just read it, and you're reading his journal entries and his diary entries, and he's talking about like, I was struggling today, and my sisters gave me this Bible verse, and that didn't help, and I felt horrible. And then he talks about like how he had this secret life where he would go off, and you know, he didn't actually love the people he was sleeping with, but he just felt like he needed that. And so it just shows you like, what are the negative impacts of that theology. I also think about Queer Eye and the Bobby on that show. Not that their stories are the same, but like he was involved in the church and he loved the church, but because he was gay, he felt the church condemned him, to the point that when Queer Eye went to do a makeover for one of the participants, he was like, I can't step foot in that church. Like, I don't feel comfortable going into a church. And just hearing his story too, and just there's so many stories that you can listen to. I'm thinking also back to high school. I had a friend where one day he was gay, and he had this bracelet that said God is love or something like that, and he was just like, yeah, I probably shouldn't be wearing this, and he made like a joke about it. But what he was saying was that this God is love doesn't make sense for me to wear if I'm gay. And like, you have to really think about that. Like, all those stories are real people and real people's lives, and I cannot live with a theology that causes people to die. I just can't. I think I'm not worried about trying to find a verse that affirms it. I'm not worried about trying to convince people that same-sex relationships, the LGBT plus community should be affirmed. Like, I'm not willing to go in a back and forth using verses to make that argument. You know, that's not what I'm for. But my argument is that if we say God is love, then God needs to be love. And if we say that Jesus loves and if we say that Jesus teaches us to love our neighbors, and we need to love our neighbors. And how do we do that? This is one of the ways that we do that. I recently saw an interview with Billy Porter, and he was talking about how the first thing that is taken from LGBT plus members in the LGBT plus community is their faith, is their spirituality. And I love that quote from him. I don't have the exact quote, but I love that he said that, because it's sad that, you know, something, you could love the church, but as soon as you come out as gay or trans or bisexual, then the church doesn't love you. And that's not okay with me. And that's not who I want to be. When I think of the church, that's not what the church is. And so I could say so much more about like my journey, but I just think that's probably a good starting place, and I hope this isn't too long. I really just want to point to the fact that I know, and I've heard so many times, like, oh, well, that's an emotional, you know, stand. That's an emotional stance to say, you know, I've heard this story and it made me sad, and so then that's why I don't believe that being gay is sinful or being trans is sinful. That's an emotional stance. Okay. I think it's more than just emotional. I think it's spiritual, because I feel it within. Like, I know it's true. Like, I know it's true that being gay or being trans or any other member of the LGBT plus community is not sinful. Like, I know that in the depths of my soul. And people aren't gonna like that. People are gonna still, I'm sure, post verses, people are gonna still you know, have arguments against it. But that's where I am, and I know, like, sometimes I feel like you just know things are true, and there's no way of saying it. And I've talked to God, because I know people, you know, pray, and, you know, they give that as advice. Like, yeah, I've talked to God. I've prayed for people. There are people in my life that I've prayed for and said, but basically at a time where I was like very confused, and I was like, I don't really know. I'll pray for you that you'll kind of figure it out. And so now it feels great to be like, yes, I'm always going to pray for you, but not because I'm unsure as to what's going to happen to you. I'm praying because I want you to come to terms with the fact that God loves you and affirms your identity. And I want you to come to that point. You know, that's why I'm praying for you, not because I'm like, oh, I don't know what's going to happen to you if you're going to be sent somewhere. No, it's because I love you and know in the depths of my soul that God loves you too, and God affirms you. And there have been too many cases in my life, and I didn't even go into as much detail as I wanted to, because things are just popping up in my head. I'm kind of forgetting, but there's so many moments. I'm thinking of a moment, college days, I wrote this poem, and it was basically me saying, like, as affirming Christian, these are the stories I've heard of people who were told that they couldn't lead worship because they were gay, or stories of, like I said, like the boy with the God is Love band. Like, he felt like he couldn't wear that. You can't give communion because, you cannot give the elements of communion because you're gay, or, you're trans. I remember reading that poem and thinking in my spirit, like, I don't even know how to describe that feeling. But like that feeling where you feel like God is just there with you and saying, like, yes, I think that's the best word to describe it. It's just like, yes, what you're doing right now, what you're speaking is me, and this is who I am, and this is who I want you to share. This is what I want you to share with others. Like, I affirm what you're doing. And that's how I felt in that moment reading that poem. It's like God loves, and I feel like I'm rambling now, but there's just been so many moments where I've been talking to people and I'm like, I'm not sure, I don't know. And then I felt like God pushing me, like, to say, you do know, what you feel inside, and you're scared because you read text or you hear people say things, like pastors tell you that it's wrong, but you know what you feel inside, and you know what I've told you. And that's what I've, felt from God. I think the only fair thing to do is just to share, like, my experience and think about, what I believe. I'm sorry, things are just kind of coming to my head now, but I remember thinking at one point, I was just like, oh my gosh, if I become affirming, and this is, I think, late high school, I was like, oh my goodness, if I become affirming, was that like the test? I used to have this obsession with, like, what's the test? Like, what's gonna separate real Christians from fake Christians. And I had this moment of thinking, like, what if the test is anyone who becomes affirming, like, then you failed it, you failed the test. And then I remember having that thought, and then right after it, which I think when that happens, like when you have an intrusive thought and you feel like truth come in, and I felt the truth of God saying, is that who I am? Do you think I'm like waiting to test you and waiting to see which way you're gonna choose? You think I'm like, just to me that just sounds evil. I mean, do you think that's who I am? And I'm like, no, like that's not who God is to me. And the more that I've prayed and just met Christians who are part of the LGBT plus community and learned a lot from them, not only just like the theology that says like this identity is valid, but also the theology that's saying like, look at the text, look at this individual who, you know, when you read it in your traditional setting is not seen as queer, but then, you know, here's an article I wrote and it shows you how they're queer. So yeah, I think in that way I'm being challenged, I'm being I'm being surprised, and I love it. And I love that on this side of being an affirming Christian is that with confidence I can say that I can love people fully. And I think that's just an amazing feeling, is being able to love people fully. And I just feel there's so many things I want to say, and hopefully if we get a conversation going in the comments and we can, you know, continue to share things about our experiences, things that we've thought, because I think that's important. Like if I just told you like, oh yeah, one day I woke up and I said, yes, being gay is fine, that wouldn't be true. Like I want to tell you like what it was like, the struggles of me feeling like, yes, this is something I believe in here, but I don't know if I'm confident enough to say that it's truth. How do I figure out that it was truth? And it was honestly because I learned to trust what I know in the depths. And I think that's probably the hardest thing to do, is because you're always going to feel like, oh, the mind is defeat, the heart is deceitful, and the mind is deceitful. Yes, that might have been an emotional response, but like, what does truth say? And I think outside of that, I've just been affirmed so many different times. You know, the fact that I was in a course in that book, Prayers for Bobby, was a sign. Like God wanted me to be reminded that this is the reality of being unaffirming. And so I just think about that a lot, and it just feels so good to feel like I can truly love people freely and openly. I've also never been someone that was like completely like, being gay is wrong. I was always someone that's like, I'm a little confused, I don't know, this is what it says, I don't really know what to do with that information, you know? So that is going to be a different journey from someone who was that's homophobic, very stark. And my prayer is that we continue to have these conversations and share our stories so that other people can change their perspectives, and other people can know that you can still be a Christian and love God and have your spirituality, just like Billy Porter was saying in that interview. Like that's the first thing that they try to take away from you, but no, like you can have that. And there are people who you can follow on Twitter who are Christian and gay, and they are encouraging, and they tell you like this is a viable option. And it hurts to me that there are Christians who, I remember when Project Runway was out, like you'd watch Project Runway, you'd see these some of the men that were gay designers, and you'd see them and you'd be like, oh, he's so funny, he's so cool, but then you preach a theology that's the opposite of affirming his identity. So it's like, what are you doing, you know? So I just think about that a lot. I'm like, how do we value people in the LGBT community fully? Have much else to say other than be respectful, learn people's pronouns, love them. I think read queer theology, like that's really helpful in becoming more comfortable and understanding like what are conversations that are being had by LGBT plus Christians. And if you haven't already, download our Bible app. It's a progressive app. And it's great because there are a lot of stories on there from LGBT plus Christians who are sharing what their experience is like, and they're sharing, some of them aren't necessarily talking about their experience of being gay, but they're just talking about like they're reading the Bible and like this is their devotion and their perspective. I mean, that's helpful because you're seeing people as more than just one-dimensional. I just want to thank you again for watching this video. I was really trying to figure out how to organize this and how to do it, so I was hoping it's not too jumbled. But essentially what I wanted to say is that being an affirming Christian to me means being Christian. It means being the true version of what love is and what it means to love someone fully. In the comments, I would love to share resources, things that we've read from members of the LGBT plus community, things that helped you become affirming, things that are challenging. You can share those things because we can have a conversation. And now you know this is affirming, like this is an affirming channel. So don't ever think that you're gonna come here and hear fire and brimstone. Like that's not what this channel is. Hopefully no one has ever made you feel otherwise, but if you ever forget, just know that you are loved and you are affirmed.